This Bertha Collective is going to be on the housing crisis in South Africa and the systems that perpetuate it. We are joined by a team from the Oxford Map the System competition and an awesome panel that we'll introduce in a moment. First of all, though, we're going to be having a word cloud for attendees to answer. So the link is going to get dropped in shortly. Please go and click the links there to the word cloud and respond to the question that is set up there. So there's a Mentimeter link that's just dropped in there, and you can go and click and input on the question there, and it'll be shared in a moment. So to give background on this collective, there was a team, so we have a program called Map the System. The team will give you a lot more detail on that, but our regional winners went to Oxford at the middle of June. They were up against 50 other teams that had done system analysis, and they got selected as the top 6 and presented on the main stage on the Sunday, and were announced as the team that won the competition. They came first out of 40 plus universities and about 1,000 teams. And what was incredible about them is the way that they engaged with their systems work. And so we're going to hear from them. The team consists of Janine Roche, Lauren Frey, and Makadze Baloyi. And we're really privileged to be joined by them. And then we've got our panel of 4 people that are joining us. They've been involved in the space. Madisha Putu is the CEO at HIP, the House. Qualified chartered accountant and certified internal auditor. He's got an impressive academic record, both locally and nationally. He's got extensive commercial experience and valuable exposure to funding, fund structuring, financial modeling, and the financial service environment. We're also joined by Ilana Meltzer. Ilana is the lead consultant and founder of 71.4 Consulting, an analytics and research consultancy. She's a lifetime consultant with over 20 years of experience. Her work is focused on demand-side research and analysis with a focus on low-income market segments. We're joined also by Francois Veruli. Francois is a property economist and associate professor. He told me not to read out his full bio, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper in there. He, as an associate professor, he lectures in urban economics, property development, and portfolio management at UCT. He's done extensive research into SA's property cycle, the drivers of the SA property market, and the relationship between urban economics and property markets in sub-Saharan Africa. And very importantly, he goes sailing on Wednesday evenings. So I thought we'd throw that little bit in there. And then we're joined by Alfonso Slinger. Alfonso is the leader and founder at the National Housing Stockfall Company. He's worked for the Christian Benevolent Society as the general manager and has spent most of his working career involved in community development. He's got a passion for driving the Stockfall methodology as a development tool. So that is our team that will be presenting and the awesome panel after them. There's still the word cloud link. If you haven't filled it out, you can do that now quickly. But yes, to introduce the team that won at Oxford, they're also doing their Masters in Development Finance at the University of Cape Town, but they're going to tell you all about that now. We'd love to welcome Janine Roche, Lauren Frey, and Maka Baloyi to present their project that won at Oxford last month.
Hi, everyone. I'd just like to check that the right screen is presenting. Is it a slideshow that you see?
Yes, it's the Bertha Centre Collective slide.
Brilliant. Okay, Lauren, go ahead.
Nice. Okay, so firstly, I would like to thank the panelists for making the time to be here. Your input is invaluable, as well as Bertha Centre for organizing this event. Also, welcome to everybody who has joined us today for this very important discussion. My name is Lauren Frey, and today Janine and I will be talking through the presentation that has brought us all together today. Our teammate Maka Baloyi is here, but she's not going to be presenting. So we are here because the 3 of us recently won the Global Map the Systems competition hosted by the University of Oxford, Said Business School specifically, where we were challenged to apply systems thinking to unpack an environmental, social, or governance problem. The topic which we had selected, which we're very excited to introduce to you, is a little known but highly influential and complex issue related to the housing crisis in South Africa. And that is financial exclusion of the missing middle from the traditional mortgage system in the country. We will be talking through some of the key findings of the investigation and the systems tools that were used to gain a better understanding of this market and the forces that underpin it. So this is a great opportunity to reflect on this very important topic further through our expert panelists, but also strengthen our understanding of the issue through a discourse representative of a variety of perspectives within the system. So I'm going to hand over to Janine, who will introduce the topic to us.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and thank you everyone for the wonderful welcome. I forgot to click the slide, but this is us winning the Matter System competition. And I think what is really exciting for us is that we get to sort of present our work to you as perhaps a crash course, if you can say, in the issue. As Lauren said, it's an issue of financial exclusion of a missing middle in the housing finance market in South Africa. It's just sort of a small piece of a really large picture of like intersecting systems between the supply of housing stock and various different stakeholders and the supply of housing finance. So obviously there are broader issues, and I'm sure that we'll discuss some of them at the end. But just to note, if any of the panelists end up disagreeing with us and our findings, we really welcome these learnings, and we're very excited for the conversation. So I guess here we go. So as the housing bubble burst in overheated property markets around the world, South Africa's predominantly Black affordable housing market surprised the market by outperforming other segments despite the recession. Housing prices in some cases grew 10 times the rate of other housing stock. And this phenomenon was lauded as an opportunity to transform and provide a lifeline to the wounded housing market. And the strong performance was attributed to interest rates being lowered to combat the recession. And this revealed that small changes in credit terms and cost lead to large improvements in accessibility. The affordable market, or what we call the missing middle, refers to households that are not poor enough to qualify for government-funded housing, but are too poor to access traditional mortgages. As you can see here, this encompasses the income levels of teachers, police officers, nurses, builders, security guards, and many other different types of households. And the average income also demonstrates that the missing middle is predominantly people of color who were previously disadvantaged under apartheid. As we know, during apartheid, 3.5 million people of color were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to areas designated by race, which were far from economic hubs and desperately lacked basic service delivery. So this sort of like creates a very important setting for our issue. And to date, we know that South African geographies and classes are still highly racialized, and we have the highest income inequality in Africa. These images show that the current racial distribution in South Africa's 3 largest metros, they show the current racial distribution where white populations are in purple and closest to economic hubs and affluent areas. So here is a brief timeline. After apartheid in the 1990s, people of color gained access to formal credits, and lenders rushed to capture the fast emerging middle class. But this crucial period of market making abruptly froze when the 2008 financial crisis hit and banks suddenly tightened credit requirements to protect themselves. Despite the promise of the affordable market in the 2010s, by 2017, only 4% of mortgages granted were to the missing middle, and 83% of first-time Black home buyers were considered ineligible. It's strange because the stars had seemed to be aligned. There's over 7 million households in the missing middle and growing, an emerging middle class that is hungry for upward mobility, a well-established property market and a strong financial sector, and housing policies that are structured specifically to realize housing rights through home ownership.
So the Iceberg Model is a tool that allowed us to dig a bit deeper into our understanding of the market by reflecting on the different perspectives that is evident in the system. This ranges from the financial institutions to the real people who represent the missing middle, and how these ideologies not only underpin the system, but fundamentally influence it. So when we looked at the surface of the problem, it showed an over-indebted missing middle with little savings who were perceived to be too risky to loan to, as well as an uncoordinated financial administrative system with little trust between the stakeholders. And when we looked even deeper, these events revealed that the dependence on unsecured lending was being used to supplement the lack of real income growth and that poor household credit management had caught the missing middle in poverty traps and debt spirals. The interviewees had consistently referred to as feeling stuck in a system with no agency or consumer-based solutions, which perpetuated the deeply entrenched systematic racism in a mortgage system purpose-built to serve a consumer that was not reflective of the majority. So these system attributes were also shown to be grounded in mental models that related to previously disadvantaged groups being seen as unreliable and risky. And it was also shown that the disenfranchisement of home ownership during apartheid resulted in housing symbolizing security and stability for Black South Africans. And importantly, within these afflictions, redress and reform was considered a government responsibility, almost absconding the private sector from responsibility. So these system characteristics not only prevented the upward mobility and wealth accumulation of the newly liberated people of color when apartheid had ended, but actively contributed towards reinforcing South Africa's racist housing segmentation.
Okay, so now we're going to take a look closer at what the mortgage market solidified into as the global financial crisis hit using our systems map. Just as a little crash course, this is our systems map as a whole. I wouldn't recommend trying to read it right now, but basically these are different elements of the system, and it shows that if one element sort of increases in strength or value, it can lead either a positive or a negative effect to the next element. So broadly, the stakeholder groups that we segmented the stakeholders into are the private mortgage providers in green, the public sector in brown, intermediaries such as researchers, property technology companies, and innovative startups in light blue, and of course the households that make up the missing middle in this pink color. So the sudden explosion of potential bondholders that came with freedom for South Africa was new for major mortgage providers. Lenders from the time report making decisions on how to lend to the affordable market based on their gut, as data and experience were unavailable. In other words, housing transactions were being shaped by sociality and the moral judgments by those in power, who were heavily influenced by racial prejudice at the time and maybe even still now. These decisions continue to racialize risk assessment frameworks for mortgage applications to date. And as an example, a researcher whose paper we read noted that whether a property had a large plot size and telephone lines has been found to be used to indicate the safety of the property and by extension its applicant in risk assessment frameworks today. However, we know that along the lines of apartheid, previously disadvantaged areas where the bulk of affordable housing is situated still experience poor service delivery such that they lack telephone lines and properties are small. This directly contributes to the exclusion of the missing middle. And ultimately, the market ended up segmented into an affordable and traditional market. Lending was territorialized around developed urban areas, which created artificial housing finance scarcity to drive high risk premiums and other risk-related revenue streams for the affordable market. The segmentation was so lucrative for major lenders that the strength of private sector lobbying prevented government attempts to legislate forced lending to the affordable market. And this contributes to an ongoing mistrust that public funds made available to lenders for the missing middle would be actually passed on to the consumer. So this graph shows data on non-performing loans, so loans that are 90 days overdue or more, between the affordable market in blue and the rest of the market in red. It is very difficult to find data on the performance of loans between the affordable and the traditional market. So hopefully our panelists maybe can shine some light, but this shows that the returns are actually higher in the traditional markets, but there are important considerations that need to be taken into account. So for example, when an affordable housing market loan goes bad, something is typically paid towards arrears of what the household is earning. And this attracts additional interest for mortgage providers. And the missing middle is less likely to prepay their mortgages, which reduces the returns on a mortgage to the mortgage lender. So all of this functions to support mortgage providers' return, and the rate of rejection of missing middle applicants is therefore actually financially counterintuitive. So moving on, government plays a key role in addressing this issue due to its impact on economic development. They drive the existing local solution landscape, which is broadly a poorly administered down payment subsidy, a government employee housing scheme, and a promising but very new public-private partnership called Housing Investment Partners. Shout out to Putu from the panel later. It's going to be very exciting to hear what he has to say. But it is new, so it's difficult to tell how effective it has been to address the issue.
Yes, and a concluding component of the Map the Systems challenge was to identify the shortcomings of the solution landscape. So the impact gap canvas was a tool developed to identify gaps within existing solutions and identifying potential tools and stakeholders that could be used to influence the system positively. These are called levers of change, but we refer to them as levers for short. So the impact gaps which were identified are reporting and monitoring, system coordination and partnerships, and visibility. So due to the poor administration, weak accountability measures, and corruption, these contribute to a lack of sustainable solutions. And we need to consistently have check-ins on the functionality, progression, and success of implemented solutions. As a lever, political pressure and policy regulation can invoke this. The private sector has also demonstrated influence over government and can apply pressure to enact policy reform that enables housing access. For system coordination and partnership speaks to the issue of the public and private sectors operating in silos. There should be greater synergy between the efficiency of the private sector and the scale and system linkages of the public sector. And ESG and impact-linked financing increases the funding available for servicing underserved markets such as the missing middle. Intermediaries can also facilitate PPPs and DCOST solutions using impact capital. For visibility, research shows that credit terms are inflated by information asymmetry, resulting in the misinterpretation of real versus perceived risk. And financial literacy also contributes to credit mismanagement. Visibility speaks to making the missing middle discernible to the lenders, and credit requirements being more transparent and accessible to the affordable market. Intermediary participation is directed by these sources of funding, often from government or from developmental organizations. The role enables them to generate informative data for mortgage provider decision-making and provide credit management counseling. So these gaps are not unique to the affordable housing issue, but they are visible throughout South African sectors utilizing systems not purposeful to suit the new South Africa or its diverse middle class. And as you can see on the map, by pulling on these levers, we can create change and innovation. Innovation such as a human settlements development bank, as well as the revision of risk evaluation criteria and technology. So a conundrum that we faced when mapping the system was, so how do we get there? It felt very overwhelming to consider this very big, intimidating system. So a system tool that was recommended to us by the Bertha Centre actually to answer this question was the 3 Horizons tool. So the 3 Horizons utilizes 3 tiers of understanding a system and placing it within a framework of what is happening now, what do we see happening in the future, and what are the noticeable pathways within the system that could link these together. So the current system gives little hope to the missing middle. The levers which we have identified are critical system institutions that may affect positive change in this market. And by using the 3 Horizons tool, we intended to frame our system within the context of progress to provide perspectives on the pathways to an equitable and transparent system. So social pressure, government intervention, and private solutions are key attributes which we see in our current system, and it remains an important component in the future of the system. The exciting visionary landscape that we have observed, such as improved technological systems, localized solutions like credit unions, which we refer to as stokvels here in South Africa. Really looking forward to Alfonso. And progress on PPP models has been made possible by incremental adjustments and transformational experiments, such as the global SDG initiatives, government guarantees, and blended finance. which are able to align levers with a pathway that realizes a visionary system that functions effectively and efficiently. So in the African markets, we found a pathway that has been incredibly impactful. And this was the use of centralized PPP liquidity organizations. These resulted in the Tanzanian mortgage market increasing sevenfold, and it reduced interest rates in Kenya to single digits. Very exciting.
So I hope it's clear from our presentation that we take quite a hopeful approach. Even the Three Horizons model it's a really sort of hopeful and positive approach to looking at the future of this issue of financial exclusion. From our research, it's clear that broadening the market to include the missing middle in South African mortgage provision provides benefits to all stakeholders, and that's not a new idea under capitalism. Research has shown, of course, that home ownership is intrinsically linked to wealth accumulation, financial stability, and access to emergency funds, upward mobility, escaping debt cycles, improved education and healthcare levels, and improved levels of income inequality in South Africa. But similarly, mortgage provision helps to stimulate markets, and ultimately supporting the missing middle is often thought of as the secret sauce to economic growth. Lauren alluded to the Human Settlements Development Bank, which we know is sort of in the pipeline with government, and it's unfortunate that we don't have a member of government on the panel. So you can't reasonably hope that it'll come anytime soon, but the creation of the Human Settlements Development Bank would open up a world of possibilities in terms of the future of this issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, team. I've heard this presentation a number of times, and it still absolutely blows my mind how you've been able to pull so many different resources, so many different interviews together, but also do all of this while all three of you having full-time jobs and studying your master's degrees and doing this research. So thank you so much for sharing with us. We're going to move into the panel discussion in a moment, but for this next section, I'd love it if everyone who's able to can switch on their cameras. It would be really nice to see the audience. And we're going to also on the side do our word cloud, but everyone, if you're able to, if you're willing to, switch on your cameras and participate with us in this discussion. We're going to allow for questions as well, so please use the Q&A function or the chat box to drop your questions in, and we'll be able to have them discussed with the panel. And before we dive into the panel discussion, the answers to what barriers are you aware of in the South African housing market? We've got a fascinating word cloud here that seems to be moving about at the same time. So we've got things like affordability, finance, information, mortgage rate, things like formal employment, access to information, affordability measures, location, social housing, identity. These are all really part of the system that we've been discussing, and show, we've got one that says racist lenders there, but in complex ways. There's a lot of complexities in the system, and it's really cool that all of these sorts of things have been brought up here. So thank you to everyone who's participated in the word cloud there, and we'll share the final word cloud at the end. But for now, let's move on to our discussion with the panel. So the panel discussion is going to be hosted by Janine, who's prepared some questions. And there'll also be questions, as I said, in the text box that you can drop in if you have any questions for the panelists or for the team. So please be sure to drop that in. And just in case you weren't here at the beginning, I'm going to do a very brief introduction of our awesome panelists. So one of the cool things is that and I don't know if Janine mentioned this, but three of the people on the panel were interviewed as part of this research, two formally and one informally. And one of the people on this panel wrote a lot of the research that went into this presentation. So it's really exciting to have a panel like this. The four people that are joining us on the panel, I think most of them have similar backgrounds to what we do. I think Alfonso might not be able to share his video. But we're joined by Putu Madisha, who is the CEO of HIP, the Housing Investment Partners, as Janine mentioned. Ilana Melsa from 71.4 Consulting, who's done a lot of research in the space. Francois Viruli, who's a lecturer, an associate professor, who also chatted to the team and Alfonso Slinger from the National Housing Stockfile Company, which is fascinating because of the potential way that stockfiles can work in the system. Right now, I'm going to hand over to Janine. Please don't forget to drop questions in the text box. I'll pop them up for Janine as well. Welcome to the panelists, and Janine, go for it. Take us away.
So I'd like to start with, I guess, sort of a very clear gap in our South African system specifically. I think that a lot of the people on this call will be familiar with the housing finance industry and might see it as a bit of an immovable space, just because South Africa has this relatively very well developed financial sector and property market, and it's not unique to the housing market that the system was developed for a small minority. In fact, South Africa's mortgage market is large and complex relative to neighboring countries, and it's made it difficult to adapt to the needs of households in South Africa. So I know that during our research process, we discussed this a little bit specifically with Francois, who I think you can see on the screen. I guess I'd really be interested in your thoughts on like what sort of achievable incremental changes you would see as being valuable steps towards making home ownership accessible for the missing middle or accessible in general, whether it's from the government, the private sector, or intermediaries.
Fine. Would you like me to start, Janine, then?
Please, yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. I suppose I always start the discussion with something I've said over the years, the 40 by 40 by 40 problem in South Africa. The 40 square meter house, 40 kilometers from where you work, where you spend about 40% of your income on transport, and you probably take 40% of your time commuting. Some have argued that I'm wrong, actually, with the first 40, because some people would wish to have a 40 square meter house. Unfortunately, it's a 20 square meter shack or house. So I could have the first number wrong. But I think what is important is that we really haven't altered that far from that scenario. And why this is important is that, and I think much of the funding and interventions that we look at are public sector. I mean, if we look at some of the intervention, and I suppose many of them are focused more on the rental market than necessarily on the ownership. If you look at many of what is being offered, actually, it's a social housing funding system that is in place. So I think that bias, first of all, would need to change. So I think that what does play a role in this as well is that if we're going to get serious private sector money into the sector, I think there's first of all a discussion around the typology of what we have here. You know, if we're going to get pension funds involved, they're not going to walk down how roads in our township buying 40 square meter houses. You've got to build at scale. And I think to some degree, we may be missing the boat there because of the urban environment where that 40% lies plays a role as well. So if you take, for example, you move back, the other extreme would be the Dutch example where private money is heavily invested in affordable housing. And here we have such a low investment in that particular sector. The other issue to bear in mind, which I always tend to relate, is that when we look at the housing ladder, and I'm going to stop at this point, is that it has its rungs, and those rungs vary from ownership and rental. Some rungs, as you move up, you move into the rental market, and then you move back into the ownership market. And I think that we haven't got the rungs correct, which allows that movement upwards, which leaves individuals stuck at a particular sector of the market. So yes, I think let me start with this, and then maybe we'll leave it to others. But I think that, and then there's something which we can discuss, of course, and that is that we're looking at funding from the user perspective. Then we have a whole world opening up on housing delivery by micro developers, who are totally underfunded, can't get their funding. I'm involved in a wonderful course on property entrepreneurship, where we have a lot of these micro developers who are just completely stuck. They go as far as they can scramble funding from family and others. And I think we underestimate the supply possibilities by the extensions that can occur in many places in South Africa. Okay, let me leave it at that, Janine.
Thanks very much, Francois. It is a huge system. It's really broad. There's a lot of niches and pockets of improvements that can happen. And I must say, the idea of micro property developers and property development entrepreneurship, it sounds extremely interesting, although of course our focus was on the finance of it. Just to all of the other panelists, please, if you have something that you're eager to add in, feel free to speak up. But I guess with this sort of question, it's interesting to hear the voices of intermediaries or researchers in the space, because they sort of look between the different stakeholders. Ilana, if I may pick on you, do you have anything that you might add in the way of sort of achievable incremental changes that you would like to see as valuable steps towards access to home ownership or access to housing for the sort of growing middle class?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. I think, the one area of work that we're very involved in is around title deeds and the state of the titling system in South Africa. And I think, I'm not sure if that made it into your framework, but it is a real problem. If I think about the area that we worked in directly in Khayelitsha, where we opened an office to help with title-related issues. Just the analysis we've done on the 5,500 properties in the immediate vicinity, at least 45% of those properties have compromised title deeds that we can see, that we know of. It's way more. And this is a relatively new area. Khayelitsha is a new area. If we went into more established township areas, I shudder to think what percentage of stock is effectively neutralized. The banks cannot play. They cannot play a role. And they know this, and that's why the emphasis of their affordable housing interventions has been on building new stock, which is unaffordable. And it's just that, sure, there's definitely stuff we could do to make the housing supply chain work better in South Africa, but new housing is expensive. It is really expensive. And what we have in South Africa is a very sizable stock of houses that were introduced into the market by the government through its subsidy program, that it has administered that program so badly that you effectively are looking at a third of that stock being neutralized from the get-go, from the start. And then on top of that, as life happens and the conveyancing system being what it is in South Africa, title is just not maintained. So I think we've really got to look at that, and I think it's useful maybe to change our frame. We can think that lenders are racist. There's probably a lot of evidence for that. I think it's also useful to look at some of the constraints they really do face. So I think between compromised title on the one hand in low-income areas, and then a complete lack of governance, just astounding. Where we see houses for sale, and advertised with 3 flats at the back, and then you look at it and the 3 flats are built on a road reserve. Like, how did that happen? Suddenly the houses were built on the road reserve. Nobody noticed, so there's no effective governance. There is absolutely no way a bank is going to finance the purchase of those properties that would be demolished if there was decent governance. So I think we've got to look at and then I think we can certainly add a layer of racism. That's a reality, but I think it's quite useful to come at the problem with a lens to the real operational challenges that manifest in low-income areas on this very, very basic level of administration and governance.
Thank you, Ilana. Yes, I completely agree with you. We actually interviewed a few people who had one person who owned specifically a house in Khayelitsha, and because of the lack of the ability for banks to finance her house being sold or bought by somebody else, she was facing being able to sell a house that was worth 850,000 Rand at only 300,000 Rand. I think that those were the figures, and that's sort of rampant throughout areas where affordable housing is available. There just is no financial market, and so there's areas are struggling to develop and are sort of stuck in this entropic decline. And also, yes, very, absolutely agree that there's an element of racism in the systems that we work within, but that doesn't absolve or sort of erase the fact that there are very serious issues aside from racism that are perpetuated within the system. I guess I'd like to sort of piggyback off of what we just spoke about. This is a question that was contributed by one of my team members. So a significant impediment to the progress that is seen in the housing market for the missing middle is the inability to sell homes for a price reflective of its value in historically Black and colored communities. Then this inhibits, as Francois said, the moving through the rungs and housing provision, and it prevents upward mobility and results in dead capital. So we'd like to know I guess, Francois, you brought this up, but even if any of the other panelists have something to say on the matter, do you, if mortgage provision access is focused on it, if there is finance available, do you think that this could play a role in treating the system dysfunction, or do you think that it's just too little? It needs the buy-in of the government, and it needs the bulk infrastructure and title deeds that Ilana was speaking about?
I think Ilana's point is critical, first of all, and I think that for many South Africans, a house is a shelter, a place from which one derives economic benefits, work, sell. But I think we're still denying many South Africans to have property as an asset class. And that denial largely happens on the basis of the title deeds. But I think that as an economist, I think what also plays a role here are the very high transaction costs in the whole system, which plays its roles. I mean, if you hear of what some brokers are charging on the sale of a house, up to 20, 30%, if not higher, you have that sorting out the conveyancing comes also at enormous rates, where a lot of conveyancers don't even want to touch it. Because of the difficulties so until we can unleash the value at the different rungs of the property market, your chance of moving forward is highly compromised. But I need to say another thing here, and that has to do with the value. Yes, the private sector, of course, has its role. But I think that the stability of a property market is also influenced by the urban environment that is created around that. I mean, if we're going to leave those houses dormitories, yes, I don't think it will get us to the value propositions that we want. I think that the biggest issue, and there's something quite interesting that is happening in the Netherlands at the moment in Rotterdam, is also a view which says, how do we allow people to move up the housing rungs but remain in the hood? In other words, how do we ensure that as people move higher income, they have social capital, they have networks in their communities? Is that completely destroyed because you need to move to the other part of town? And I think that if we can get that right, I think that also plays a role in how the risk is perceived in these particular markets. So I think that the overall system, whether it's the planning system, plays a role in the risk profile that is seen around the residential property market. Look, I think we can also move to discussions around saying, should we move to other parts of town? And then we're into the exciting world of inclusionary housing and others, which whether inclusionary housing is the answer, I doubt it, if the American experience is anything to show by. But anyway, let me leave to a discussion maybe around SDGs, because I think that there is funding coming our way. And I think where the optimistic view is, to be honest, the only game in town at the moment is the residential property market, because you're not exactly going to invest in retail or the office market at the moment. So I think the flow of money will alter in that respect.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Francois, I hope so. 66% of all houses in Cape Town is above 600,000 rand.
Exactly.
43% of that, of the housing market, is about 1.2 million. So if you look at those two horrific statistics, if there is no entry-level housing or entry-level housing market, you can never, ever get people to move up the ranks, because they basically have an option, 600,000 plus or 1.2 million plus. And how can we talk about inclusive housing if that is the options people have?
Absolutely, and I think that's our challenge. It's that Gini coefficient that plays itself, the steepness of this. And where in the US they go inclusionary 60% of the average, well, that doesn't get you to the numbers that you're talking to, Alfonso. So it is exactly that gap that we are. The irony was that was the best performing sector of the market until 28. And now, of course, the balance sheet of the middle income has been eroded through inflation and higher interest rates and so forth. But that was the market that was rising by 10, 11%. That's where the demand was.
If I may squeeze in, I think it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit from Putu, who, just to remind everyone, is the CEO of Housing Investment Partners. So Housing Investment Partners, I'll let Putu speak about it, but is a public-private partnership founded between Old Mutual, Future Growth Asset Management, and the National Housing Finance Corporation, if I may be incorrect. So Putu, I'd love to hear, what has the market's reaction been to HIP, Housing Investment Partnership? And what are you finding is preventing or pushing people from this missing middle group to apply for mortgages with HIP as a solution to affordability?
Thanks, Janine. Good evening, all. Very interesting discussion so far. And I think overall, if I look at HIP and its history, so HIP was sort of conceptualized and registered in 2009, but it took some time to get the initial loans out. So that started in 2013. We were living in a very different financial world than we are today. Overall, I would say that HIP's impact in the market has been incredibly positive. When we see what's transpired since 2013, there was really no focus by the big banks in affordable housing. So one of the major problems HIP currently has is because we came into an environment where there was pretty much no supply of demand funding. So the way we were able to raise funding, get our cost structures in place, we were able to issue loans at prime plus 4.5%. But there was nothing else, there were no alternatives. So what we've actually shown in the market is that you can bank in the affordable housing sector and it can be profitable and it can work out for all parties involved. And we've actually seen that since 2013, as pretty much all the big banks now have a dedicated affordable housing department. It's a great win for the market. It just makes things a lot tougher for HIP as a company, but we need to remain innovative and still address the issue at hand. When I joined HIP in 2017, I was still talking about 2.3 million housing shortage. Nowadays, they're talking about a 3 million housing shortage, growing at about 200,000 units annually. So the problem is not solved. We can still get there. What is preventing some of the missing middle access, especially to the demand side funding, is that, to be perfectly honest, even in our communities of color, wealth creation is not something we speak about. Francois touched on, is it provision of shelter or is it an asset, And I always try and say, let's look at housing as a financial asset. My dad is a doctor. He did pretty well. He sent 4 kids to UCT Res. And just to give you an example, he paid his res fees. He didn't once think of, I could have bought a flat. And he could have had a flat in Great Rondebosch, paid off, by virtue of that. So we need to have these discussions almost around a dinner table, Some of the other issues, though, is also, once again, I'm still pointing fingers at the community itself, is that the way we look at our monthly expenses and how we spend, we almost want to show our wealth, and it's a lot easier to do that with other things than with housing. 40% con residual on a 40% residual, then sort of, save for a deposit for a home loan. If I look at our financial institutions as well, they will push unsecured short-term debt in an instant, 2-minute loan approval. Try get a home loan and see the hurdles and the rigorous processes you'll have to go through. These are some of the issues that do prevent it. From HIP's point of view, one of the issues that pushes missing middle to home ownership is the actual pride that our customers take in home ownership. We do some tours of some of the areas where we've built houses, and we saw it in 2020, 2021. You got COVID, you got people getting 75%, 50% of their salaries, people, obviously some people going to zero. We had tons of payment plans we put in place. The number of customers that have actually stuck to those plans has been incredible. If I look at our financial metrics, we weren't sort of breaching any of our major covenants. We weren't, struggling to sort of meet funded returns. And when we speak to our customers, they'll say, look, we're struggling in these areas. I'm cutting where I can cut, but guys, I really want to keep my home. And they are willing to have honest conversations with their financier. Someone like me who's, got a house in Sandton, I'll act, all pompous and stuff and say, I'll speak to my lawyer, and leave it to the very end, And so what that also says to me is that this is really a bankable sector in the market. But before I finish off, I just want to say, we talked about the 40-40 that Alfonso touched on. In my dream world, one of the big issues we have, Alfonso also touched on, the 600,000. In 2022, HIP's loan book has averaged, the loans issued this year, have averaged 600,000 Rand. So that's kind of where the market is. But you must remember, the private sector has to buy a farm, basically. It takes about 10 years from the purchase of that land to eventually get it into service stands, get there, Section 182, and then eventually start Section 82 and eventually start selling units. So just the financing of that, that's like half the value of the property. It's just that alone. So in my dream world, I see government providing service stands. You have small black developers building the top structure at about 300,000 Rand. I did some quick numbers with the HIP model, even with a bank, as long as and then the financial institutions not adding too much margin. You're talking a prime loan. You can literally get a home loan out at 2,000 Rand. That means, you're going to be earning 6.5 thousand Rand gross a month. That means the person building the house can actually purchase that house. And that's sort of the ideal that we are striving for. Thank you.
Thank you, Putu. That was incredibly valuable and interesting. I'd just like to take this opportunity to look in the comment section. There's some excellent questions. One from Carsten Lausberg. I'd like to direct this to you, Alfonso. He or she or they have asked that cooperatives were briefly mentioned in the presentation. Compared to other countries, South Africa has a negligible cooperative sector. Do you see a trend toward more housing cooperatives or financing co-ops?
Yes and no. Yes. People are looking at alternatives, especially with the present economic situation. But also no, there's a lot of terms of legislation and various other factors that are key. For instance, in terms of, if one look at the Financial Act and the Collective Investment Schemes Act and all of these types of acts, which are actually written to keep the cooperatives and other role players out. Because if you're taking money from someone, they say you are a deposit-taking institution, and now you need to find anything from 50 to 250 million Rand to go get a license to operate as a bank. So, seriously, are we trying to help people? Or are we trying just to protect the market here for a couple of players? Mm-hmm. And we need to ask those kind of questions. And in terms of them playing a role, I do think that they have a role to play. I also think that going forward, many of those cooperatives will actually come to fore. Putu mentioned that he didn't have actually problems in terms of his people, in terms of payment. You know, it's a well-known secret that the poorest of the poor are actually your best payers for some reason or other. And sometimes because certain things get blown out of proportion, we think that because the person may be struggling to pay, that they are bad payers. But then it's not the fact. It's maybe that because they have to make that choice and they need to choose between keeping the job, because there's money that needs to go for transport, there's money to need to go to food, there's money that have to pay for the school the fees, the school fees, and those sort of things. And they make those kind of tough choices. And sometimes, yes, it is debt that needs to be overlooked or skipped for the 1 month in order for them to make it. And again, you know, there's such a lot of things that needs to be addressed in this country, from the way we give the credit to the factors that we look at when giving those kind of credit, and also whether or not we want to see a growing market. I will justify this by, if you look at the stokvels, we've got more than 800,000 stokvels active in this country. And yet we are told South Africans are poor savers. We're not. We're actually good savers. However, because of a system that kept people at a certain level, right, they were forced to be short-term savers. And if you look at your stokvels, most of them operate for that year or so, where they are short-term in nature and not long-term. And we also need to look at that. How can we educate our people and get them to commit to being more long-term savers and looking at the house, as Peter mentioned, and other assets, so that there is that growth? Because why can't a stokvel, community-based, take that money and put it in buying land and then accessing finance to build houses for that community? Why cannot the wealth that they have be placed in that community? Why must it go to a bank that's going to give them a 2% interest if they're lucky?
Thanks, Alfonso. Ilana, you have a hand up?
Thank you. Really just a question back to you. You know, the recommendation about a Human Settlements Development Bank, I think, sure, one doesn't want to totally write off the possibility that South Africans, you know, the South African state competently, but we have abundant evidence that state failure is, I mean, we can talk about market failure, and there certainly are, you know, lots of cases of that, and oligopolies and all of that. But I mean, if we were to characterize the problems in South Africa at the moment, I mean, for me personally, state failure would be at the top there. And isn't the recommendation for a Human Settlements Development Bank just going straight back down that path again of loading more onto an overburdened, undercapacitated state to begin with?
That's interesting. Francois, do you want to add on to? Yes, go ahead, Alfonso.
Sorry, I don't mean to hog.
No, go ahead.
The thing, but you know, what the question that you pose is a good and a relevant one, Ilana. But unfortunately, if we look at the system and the way it's structured and operated, then it actually doesn't leave the government with much maneuvering. It would have been nice if we had a government that could make certain funds available, and then the private sector would access that fund and then build, so that we end up more with a normal economy, like it's characteristic of the Western world, than what we have now. So the government is forced to deliver, you know, and let's face it, you, me, and everybody here, we are the government. And we are demanding that the government do something in terms of housing. So, you know, in the US, there is a law that the financial institution, about 5% of their capital needs to go to various projects, whether it's social in nature or those kind of projects, which are actually developmental in nature. We don't have that kind of law in this country. So our banks rob the poor to give to the rich, because I can't recall any bank that had a profit of below 5 billion for the last couple of years. How much of that profit went to housing or to entrepreneurship or anything else that is aimed at developing the economy? In fact, for the last decade or so, their lending has been year on year exactly the same. Year one, they might have more money in a credit card in terms of lending. Year two, it might be vehicle finance. Year three, it might be housing. But the actual amount of money that they lend out or borrow to people, that has stayed exactly the same. So their fees have gone up, but they have kept the amount of money that's being borrowed exactly the same. So how can we not have a problem with such a system?
Thank you, Alfonso.
I'm going to interrupt briefly. We've got 2 hands up from panelists, and then we're going to have to wrap up. We've already gone over time, but
I'm happy that we move on to others. I think you've heard me already. So.
You sure, Francois, that you want to chip in there? Okay.
Oh, you're on mute.
Okay,
Okay.
I'm sure others have something to say. Okay, I'll come at the end.
Okay.
Very briefly, I want to touch on the big bad banks, and I can't believe I'm going to defend the banks here. I need to have my head examined. But but to be perfectly honest, Alfonso said something important. He said, "We are the government." There's something else that's linked here. We are also that bank's shareholders. So yes, we can speak about how big business behaves, but I was reading this book by Hans Rosling called Factfulness, and he talks about this in such detail of going down to who is that eventual shareholder, and it's unfortunately your grandmother with her pension or whoever it is, but we also demand 20% returns as shareholders, and that kind of eventually ends up perpetuating the entire system. So we also, as citizens, need to be a lot more responsible and more active in sort of saying to these big corporates, this is not good enough that we just simply get our returns. Where are we going to see the social change? And that's why sometimes we are surprised by the lack of social change. But when we look at our monthly statements on our investment portfolios, we then put a very different hat on and act like there isn't a link. But lastly, I just want to reiterate on sort of the whole ecosystem, and Alfonso touching on the group lending. I mean, we have been investigating that. Yes, the deposit taking is an issue, but there's also an issue of actually getting that group functioning appropriately, because it's not like a simple thing where you, depending on how big the stockpile is, you can allocate a housing unit to each participant every month. Someone has to be at the back of that line, and we've seen that caused a few problems. But I still think one of the major parts the government can play, as opposed to just issuing the funding, is really to say, here are service stands. Obviously, you've got to be very careful that people don't come and squat on them overnight, and then allow sort of smaller developers, and that would really galvanize the entire system. Thank you.
Thank you, Putu. I really appreciate that this conversation has got to, I think, the crux of the issue in a lot of ways. I don't know, Francois, if that is an old hand, or do you want to have a last comment?
Look, the one thing I haven't got much confidence in state housing banks. I don't think there's been a great success globally, maybe with the exception of Thailand or somewhere. But there are, of course, other mechanisms. The Singapore example, housing provident funds instead of the skills levy. How do you build up deposits? So I think there are other mechanisms that are in place. and that one could look at. But I think that we've got to be careful to pin the whole problem on the funding side of it. I think that also what this work has shown is that there are structural issues. There's structural issues in our planning. There are structural issues in, if we want to make it affordable, we'll pump up the supply. Now you can have discussions about that as well. But talk about the cooperatives. I mean, I was always amazed to hear that whole of Kenya has got 35,000 mortgage bonds or something like that. I think it's a bit higher or a bit lower, but I think it's plus or minus that. Then you say, how does the housing market work in that sphere? And surprisingly, it does. So, and of course, there are problems everywhere. But I think it is an issue which I think we're bringing out here, that the system itself, in all its aspects, that we've got blockages that play their role in this, including a bit of behavioral economics and finance from my good friend Carsten Larsberg, who taught me that, who introduced that to me quite some time ago, the biases of our investors. I think that those biases, which are not based on reality, which we've just heard of from Alfonso as well. I mean, these are good payers most of the time, but there's a bias towards the sector, which I think is a structural issue as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Francois. And thank you to the panel as a whole. Really incredibly interesting insights, and I loved listening to it. Rowan, do you want to take over?
Awesome. That was, I mean, I wish this panel could go on for a lot longer. I feel like they were internal discussions that needed to happen there and so many other streams. But we do need to wrap up. This has been one of the most phenomenal Bertha collectives. And so I'd just like to give thanks to everyone quickly, and then we're going to close it out. First of all, thank you to all of the people that are participants and are listening in. I've seen names of really incredible people that have come to listen in on this conversation. So thank you for your time and for engaging with an issue like this. It's pervasive, it affects a lot of people, and it's really cool that people from all over the place have joined us on these discussions. A massive thank you to our panel. I could listen to everyone here for ages. I feel like we need to set up like a 4-hour discussion at some point, or a debate over a couple of glasses of wine. Ilana, thank you for your insights and your deep knowledge. Alfonso, thank you for all of the elements that you brought in. Putu, your understanding from being in an organization that gives these loans is a very unique perspective and is actually helping fix the system itself. And Francois, your deep knowledge, plus your sailing on Wednesday evening. So really brought it together. But on a serious note, thank you for all of the research and everything that you've contributed. And second to last, thank you to the Finclusive team. You've brought this discussion together. You've catalyzed a lot of this. And this is a lot about what systems work is. Systems work isn't just the actual physical building of houses, but it's the discussions, the motivations, it's bringing together people like this and finding small areas that we can tweak to make the system better. So everyone in this discussion is playing a role in that, and we're all pointing in the same direction. And hopefully we can see the system improve over the 3 horizons that Lauren mentioned. And last but not least, thank you so much to the Bertha Centre, as always, for organizing this. We're always super grateful to the Bertha Centre for convening and for bringing these discussions to life, for supporting Map the System as a program, and for hosting these collectives. Iviwe, thank you for organizing. Diana, thank you for organizing. And Bertha Centre, thank you for being at the very, very heart of all of these discussions as usual. Have a fantastic evening, everyone. These details will be shared further, and there'll be a recording of the session. But have a fantastic evening, and thanks again for joining on this discussion.